There is a house on Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles where one of the greatest actors who ever lived is chosen to disappear. No press release was issued. No farewell film was announced. No late-night interview explained the decision. One day, Jack Nicholson was everywhere, on magazine covers, at Lakers games, walking red carpets with that grin that made the whole room tilt. And then, slowly, deliberately, he was nowhere. For 15 years, the man who defined an era of American cinema has lived behind closed gates, and the world has been left to fill the silence with rumors, concern, and eventually a kind of reverent acceptance. But the silence was never random. It was chosen. And understanding why requires going back much further than his final film, back to a childhood built entirely on a lie that nobody told him he was living inside. He came into the world on April 22nd, 1937, in New York City. Though his roots were in Neptune, New Jersey, a small shore town where everybody knew everybody and scandal spread faster than weather. His mother, June Nicholson, was a teenager when she became pregnant, unmarried, and in love with a man who already had a wife and a life that didn't include her. To avoid the shame that would have followed both families, June traveled to New York to give birth quietly, away from the whisper networks of their town. She returned home without a baby, at least officially. The baby came home too, but not as her son. Her mother, Ethel May, registered the child as her own. June was reclassified as the older sister. And Jack Nicholson grew up in a house with the most important truth about him. Who he came from, where he belonged, was buried under a fiction maintained by love, by fear, and by the particular cruelty of a social world that punished women for what it also demanded of them. He didn't know. That's the part that settles in slowly when you think about it. He grew up calling his grandmother his mother, and his mother his sister, and nobody in that house ever cracked. The man he believed was his father was actually his grandfather, a quiet man who dressed department store windows for a living. Ethel May cut hair. The household was modest and fractured at its foundation, built on a secret so large it had its own gravity, pulling everything in the family into orbit around it without anyone naming what they were circling. Jack absorbed the atmosphere of that silence long before he had any language for what silence could mean. He learned, at the most fundamental level, that the surface of family could look one way while its interior was something else entirely. He learned that people could love you and still keep the most important part of themselves, and of you, carefully hidden. He didn't learn the truth until 1974, when he was 37 years old, and already one of the most recognizable faces in the country. A researcher working on a Time magazine cover story called him and delivered a revelation over the phone, almost casually, the way devastating news sometimes arrives, not in a dramatic confrontation, but an ordinary moment that reshapes everything that came before it. The woman he called mother was his grandmother. The woman he called sister was his mother. And both of them were already dead. June had died of cancer in 1963. Ethel May had followed in 1970. The people who had carried the secret, who could have explained their reasons, who might have offered something like context or apology or just a bare fact of what had happened, all of them were gone before the secret was. Jack Nicholson was left holding a truth that had no one left to answer for it. What he said about it afterward was almost more striking than the revelation itself. He said it was dramatic, not dramatic. He said he was already fully formed by then, psychologically speaking, and that the discovery didn't break him. And maybe that was true. Or maybe the kind of man who grows up inside a secret becomes so fluent in the language of emotional distance that even a revelation of that magnitude doesn't pierce the outer layer. Because the marks were there, visible in the shape his life took from then on. He never married. He had children with different women across different decades, but never built the kind of anchored domestic life that the word family implies. The boy raised inside a beautiful lie became a man who kept the world close enough to perform for, but far enough away to remain, at his core, unknowable. That was the first thing that shaped Jack Nicholson. Everything else grew from that soil. His path into Hollywood was not the story of a golden boy discovered and elevated. It was the story of a decade of near misses, failed films, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has nothing to fall back on. His first job in the industry wasn't even acting. He ran errands for the cartoon studio where Tom and Jerry was produced, carrying mail and coffee while watching the entertainment machine from its outermost ring. When they offered him a full-time animator position, he turned it down because the salary was lower than what he was already making. Months later, the division closed entirely. Whatever he was going to be, it wouldn't be in animation. He drifted toward acting classes and found himself in a room run by Jeff Corey, a former actor who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy years and had transformed that loss into a teaching philosophy. Corey believed that acting was not about manufacturing emotion, but about living so deeply and honestly that emotion arose naturally from real experience. That idea took root in Nicholson and never left. Through the mid-1960s, he appeared in film after film that nobody saw, accumulating credits without momentum, writing screenplays on the side because nobody was handing him leading roles. The part that changed everything didn't even come to him through the normal channels. Easy Rider, the 1969 film that became a cultural detonation, cast him only because another actor walked off set after an argument with director Dennis Hopper. Jack Nicholson stepped into the role of George Hansen at the last minute and walked out of it as someone the entire country suddenly needed to watch. His first Oscar nomination followed, and then came one of the most extraordinary stretches any actor in the sound era has produced. 5 easy pieces, Chinatown, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Shining, Terms of Endearment, Batman, A Few Good Men, As Good as It Gets, 3 Academy Awards, 12 nominations. Roles that didn't just win prizes, but embedded themselves into cultural memory so deeply that decades later, people still imitate the laugh, the raised eyebrow, the grin that always seemed to contain something dangerous underneath the charm. By the time the millennium turned, Jack Nicholson wasn't merely famous. He was something more specific than famous. He was a permanent fixture in the American imagination, the actor whose face you saw when you close your eyes and try to picture what a movie star was supposed to look like and feel like and do. He sat courtside at Lakers games in sunglasses, and the cameras always found him. He negotiated a profit-sharing deal on Batman that reportedly made him somewhere between $60 and $90 million. A piece of business that said everything about how clearly he understood his own value. He was not a man who underestimated himself. He was not a man who gave things away. But there was another story running underneath the legend, one that gets less attention than the performances and the awards because it's harder to package neatly. His romantic life was enormous in scale and punishing in its patterns. He was with Angelica Houston for 17 years, a relationship so long and so intertwined with both of their careers that it seemed structural, like something that simply couldn't end. And then he ended it at dinner, telling her that another woman was going to have his child. Houston, who had faced her own painful experiences with fertility, understood exactly what she was being told and what she was being asked to accept. She didn't accept it. She said there was only room for one woman in the picture, and that she was stepping aside. 17 years, concluded over a meal. He had 2 children with Rebecca Broussard, a son and a daughter, but that relationship also eventually dissolved. A relationship with Laura Flynn Boyle in the early 2000s ran its course. By his late 60s, the romantic energy that had defined so much of his public persona, the reputation for appetite for experience, for living wider and louder than anyone around him, had quieted. He didn't announce that it had quieted. He just stopped pretending otherwise. In a 2013 interview with Vanity Fair, one of the last real conversations he had with the press, he said something that stayed with everyone who read it. He said he was no longer driven to be out there. He said the only projects he could still get excited about were ones that dealt with real human emotion, the kind that actually moved people rather than just occupied them for 2 hours. And then he admitted that during his final films, he had barely left his hotel room at night, that the off-screen energy he had once poured into living had dried up, and that he no longer had enough of it to split between working and the kind of life he had always led alongside the work. That was the moment the door became visible, because once he named what had changed, the silence that followed made a different kind of sense. He wasn't refusing to work. He was being honest about the fact that the thing driving him to work had left before the work itself did. His last film, a romantic comedy called How Do You Know, was released in December 2010 and disappeared quickly, losing enormous amounts of money at the box office. He never made another one, not with fanfare, not with a statement. He simply did not appear again, and the industry eventually stopped holding its breath for him to return. The rumors that followed were predictable. There were reports of memory problems, suggestions of dementia, speculation that he could no longer retain lines well enough to work. People close to him pushed back on those reports, insisting he was reading scripts, considering projects, mentally intact. And there was credibility to that counter-narrative, because directors who worked with him described him as still engaged, still curious, just never quite pulled back across the threshold from consideration to commitment. He was reportedly in talks for an American remake of a German film in 2017 that would have been a significant return, and for a moment the possibility seemed real. Then it wasn't. The production fell apart after he stepped away from it. The door he was said to be still holding open never produced a film. By the early 2020s, the picture that emerged from those close to him was of a man living almost entirely within the walls of his Mulholland Drive compound, physically stable but operating in a world that had contracted dramatically. His children had become his most constant companions. His daughter Lorraine and son Ray, who has built his own acting career, were the primary presences in his daily life. Ray has spoken about his father with a directness and affection that is striking, describing how different their generations were, how the things that shaped one man in 1937 were not the things shaping a man born in 1992, but also saying that he had eaten dinner with his father every single night growing up, and that watching him was how he had learned what it meant to be a human being. That is not the description of an absent father. That is a description of a man who, whatever else he was, showed up at the table. In February of 2025, the world got its most unexpected and revealing glimpse of him in years. NBC aired a special celebrating 50 years of Saturday Night Live, and Jack Nicholson was there, seated in the audience at Studio 8H in New York, wearing a dark jacket and tinted glasses and a Yankees beret. He leaned forward and spoke 5 words into a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Adam Sandler." The room erupted. Sandler, visibly moved, pointed into the crowd and told everyone to give it up for Jack, that Jack had made out that night, that he loved him. Photographers caught Nicholson the next day outside his hotel, walking with Kane, his daughter, beside him. He was 87 years old. The gap between the man in that beret and the man who had once terrorized an empty hotel in the Colorado mountains was more than 4 decades wide. It was visible in every photograph. But he had come. And for someone who had spent 15 years behind a gate, the act of coming carried an enormous amount of weight. He had never hosted Saturday Night Live in his career, a fact he had said he regretted. So when he showed up for the 50th anniversary not as a performer but as a man in a seat, it read as something more than an appearance. It read as a quiet acknowledgement that certain chapters were genuinely closed and that he was at peace with closing them. And then, 8 months later, Diane Keaton died. She was 79, taken by pneumonia, and her death removed one more person from the small and shrinking circle of people who still had real access to Nicholson. They had been friends for decades, co-stars in a film that meant something to both of them, and her presence in his life had been one of the threads still connecting him to the world he had stepped back from. Those close to him were deeply concerned about how the loss would land. When you are already living a contracted life, losing one of the few remaining constants doesn't just hurt, it shrinks the world further. But even in his withdrawal, the old Jack surfaced in moments that mattered. When wildfires tore through the Los Angeles area in early 2025 and Angelica Houston lost her home, Nicholson reportedly offered her his Mulholland Drive house. Quietly, without turning it into a story, the woman whose heart he had broken over dinner decades earlier found shelter in his gates, and neither of them made it public. That gesture, private, unhesitating, requiring nothing in return, said something about who he was underneath the performances and the mythology. He was still paying attention. He was still connected to the people who had mattered to him. He had just chosen to do it from a distance that the rest of the world couldn't cross. The real reason Jack Nicholson vanished is not a single thing. It is the accumulation of everything. The body that slowed down, the relationships that ended, an industry that evolved away from the kind of raw and dangerous presence he had built a career on, and a fundamental shift in what the work cost versus what it gave back. But the deepest explanation is the one his inner circle offered the press in plain language. They preferred that people remember him as he was. That is not a statement about illness or incapacity. That is a statement about a man who understood, with complete clarity, what his legacy was and what it needed from him to remain intact. Not another film, not a press tour, just the absence that protects the image. The silence that lets the best performances remain the last thing the world holds on to. Jack Nicholson did not get erased by Hollywood. He erased himself from it, deliberately and without apology, before the world had a chance to watch him diminish in public. He gave 4 decades of performances that will outlast everyone alive to see them, and then he gave something rarer and harder: the discipline to stop, to close the gate, to let the grin, the eyebrow, the axe through the door, the white room, the courtroom outburst, the Yankees beret, and a crowd of people who still couldn't believe he was there, to let all of it be enough. Because it was. It always was. And the man who grew up inside a silence that no one explained to him found, in the end, that the silence he built for himself was the one thing that finally made complete sense.